This is the Mormon Mixed Faith Marriage Podcast with certified life coach Brooke Booth, episode number 142. So let's just check in to all of you in a mixed faith marriage who are feeling some anxiety or concerns. It's not always easy being in a mixed faith marriage. It can be scary, really scary. You may be worried or concerned. Maybe they're going to judge you, or you're going to experience rejection, concerns and fears around the kids, being hurt or confused, or your spouse being hurt. You worry it might not be worth it. You're also probably super courageous, and you're probably doing what you feel is right on your own faith journey, whether that's to stay in the church or to leave it, to be a believing spouse or a non-believing spouse. When it's scary and uncertain, can you trust that you're resilient and can do hard things? Can you trust there will be support for you, maybe even from unlikely places? It is scary, and you are also courageous. So I wanted to offer that little pep talk to those of us who are anxiously attached, because that's all of us at one point or another. I want to talk a little bit about anxious attachment and how it can show up in a mixed faith marriage, and some ideas and suggestions to work through, one particular manifestation of anxious attachment. In order to do that, let's talk about what it means to be anxiously attached, what it means to be avoidantly attached, and then walk through an example. Anxious attachment individuals obviously have more anxiety, right? They're individuals who desire closeness and intimacy in a relationship. And when they perceive emotional distance, it provokes anxiety. They struggle with that. They tend to express their emotions maybe more openly or intensely. They tend to be considered more emotional. They seek reassurance and validation from their partners. And when they feel like they're not getting that, or not getting that regularly, or getting it enough, in an enough way, they feel like their needs and affection are not met. And it's very distressful, and it's very concerning to them. It's been said that anxious individuals have a fear of abandonment and rejection. And so anything that they perceive as a threat to the relationship is going to obviously provoke that anxiety. They're going to become clingy, seek reassurance, all in an effort to alleviate their anxiety. So obviously, this is exactly what a faith transition can be. It can be that thing that is perceived as a threat, and that can really ramp up fears of being rejected, or being alone, or being abandoned. And the clinginess, the neediness, the seeking of reassurance can be the effect. Avoidant people, and it's helpful to understand anxious people by avoiding avoidant people, because they sort of are like the yin and the yang here. Avoidant individuals, they tend to have more difficulty with emotional intimacy. They prioritize their independence. They prioritize their personal space. They are more reserved in expressing emotion or vulnerabilities. They may get too uncomfortable when people come too close physically or too close emotionally. They tend to withdraw, pull back. And this is often because of a fear of being dependent. And they see sometimes partnership or other people being a threat to their independence and sparking this fear of dependence, which ultimately stems from being afraid of being abandoned as well, or rejected as well. So they will make the first move. Well, if you're going to abandon me, I'm going to abandon you first. And that's the avoidance. If you're going to leave me, I'll leave you first. If you're going to hurt me, I'll hurt you first. It's the abandonment, fear coming up for avoidance. And then there's obviously secure attachment. We're not going to talk about that so much in this podcast, because I want to spend most of the time talking about how the anxious attachment may manifest in your mixed faith marriage. And I want to say this about it is, you're not always purely avoidant or purely anxious or purely secure. We are a mixed bag as humans. It can vary from relationship to relationship, from situation to situation, where we fall here in our different attachment styles. Because we're not that simple as humans. We are, in fact, complex. So, for instance, you may be avoidant generally with your mom and your relationship with her, but you might be anxious with your wife when you talk about like finances, but you might be avoidant with your wife when talking about parenting or with your husband. And so it's not it's not just like a hat you wear and then that's the only hat you wear. You can be switching from anxious to avoidant throughout the day as you go to work and then come home, or as different topics or different situations arise. So what I'm about to say about this like anxious attachment issue, I think is almost universally applicable, because at some point or another, we are going to be that anxious person, exhibiting the anxious attachment tendencies. So when we're in that place of anxious attachment, because of the anxiety, because of that emotion that's causing us discomfort, we tend to seek emotional regulation from others. And often, and obviously in the case of a mixed faith marriage, that's going to be the spouse. We're seeking them to soothe our anxiety, remove our anxiety, comfort us, emotionally regulate that anxiety for us. So we become like an anxiously attached person is emotionally dependent on their spouse to regulate that for them. This can be anything from soothing behaviors to like emotionally dumping, expecting soothing behaviors, or emotionally dumping on one's partner. It's perfectly okay to seek reassurance and seek validation. Those are not bad traits. Even being anxiously attached is not a bad thing. This isn't like a cancer that needs to be cut out and removed. It's just something to be aware of so that you can understand your behavior and decide how you want to show up and know how to manage yourself so that you can create what you want to in this relationship and show up how you want to show up in this relationship. So, like I said, seeking reassurance and seeking validation, they're fine. It's sometimes when it sort of notches up where we are maybe using the relationship as an emotional dumping ground. We're always seeking our partner to act as our emotional regulator. What these may sound like is, I'm upset and anxious. Your job is to fix that. Like, it's your fault I'm anxious. You need to solve that for me. Let me give you an example of how it may look like from a mixed faith marriage point of view. Is, let's say somebody who is anxiously attached is, and this, I'm going to give you an example both from the believing and the non-believing route, because it can show up either way. I'm worried about the kids' decision regarding seminary. I don't think it's good for their health to wake up early. They're already stretched so thin. This is going to cause burnout. I'm really concerned about their mental, emotional, and physical health. Okay. This may be an anxiety that non-believers circles around. Anxious believer, it may sound like, I'm really worried about the kids regarding seminary. They need to have this in their life in order to deal with the pressures and stress that they face at school. If they don't have this, they're not going to have an anchor. They're going to become lost. They're going to make bad decisions. It can sound like everybody has their own version of anxious attachment. And then what this may sound like in the context of a relationship is like, I'm really upset, I'm really scared, and you need to soothe me. Like, you need to calm me down, preferably by changing your views and stance and the direction your faith journey is headed. Or, this is your fault that I have to deal with this. You had to go and rock the boat. Or, you're being selfish and you're hurting the family. Or, you don't love and support me. Or, you don't care about the kids and you don't care about the impact your decisions are having on this family. You're selling the kids short. It can sound like any of these things or many other things. And when this is happening in a marriage, if you are the person who's anxiously attached and you don't get that emotional regulation from your spouse, where they're not responding to these things by coming in and being that emotional regulator for you and soothing you, you will feel unloved and unsupported. You will feel abandoned. You will feel that they are not taking care of you. If you don't give it to your emotionally attached spouse, you may feel selfish or cold. You may feel like you are not supporting them, not loving them. And that can be really tricky because it can really keep us locked into the cycles caused by anxious attachment. So it can be helpful to just pause and take a breath and realize that there's a cost to that level of emotional dependence. There's a cost associated with having our emotional regulation come from our spouse, and where we expect our spouse to be our emotional regulator. Because that's a lot of times what's happening with anxiously attached people is they want to give the responsibility of regulating their emotions to their spouse. When this happens, some of the costs are this can feel parentification. Like it can feel like you're having to parent your anxiously attached spouse, or like your spouse is having to parent you if you're anxiously attached. Because as parents, that's what we do for our kids in large part is we do help regulate their emotions. When they're a 2-year-old having a tantrum, we come in and we help them regulate their emotions. When they're 9 years old and they're stressed about something that happened at recess, we help regulate their emotions. When they're 15 and learning how to drive, we help regulate their emotions. Like it is part of being a parent. And so when we do that with our adult spouse, another adult, our spouse, and we feel like we now have to regulate their emotions, it's just not sexy. Like there is going to be that parentification happening in that relationship. Another thing that it can create too is it can feel like a burden, like you're being a burden or your spouse is being a burden or needy. You're being needy or your spouse is being needy or taken advantage of. You're being taken advantage of or you're taking advantage. You may feel like you're not loving enough or being loved enough. You can never give enough. They can never give enough. These are all things that can indicate that there's an anxious attachment. It's basically like a cup with a hole in the bottom. Well, you can give, but that cup, it just cannot fill itself. It just always empties. So this is all just to help you look at your own relationship, look at your own tendencies, and get really curious. Like, where am I showing up anxiously attached? Where am I showing up seeking my spouse to be my emotional regulator? Where am I showing up dumping on them emotionally? Where am I showing up blaming them for my emotions? And just getting curious about that. How did the faith transition maybe aggravate some of the emotional attachment issues that we were already experiencing? And then I want to offer you this is there's another way of dealing with emotions that come up in a marriage other than to give that responsibility to our spouse to be our emotional regulator. And this is going to sound obvious, but I think it's really important to say, and it's something I say a lot, is I think a great secure attachment approach here is when both adults, both partners can take care of their own emotional regulation, can take responsibility for their own emotional regulation and not dump that on their spouse or ask that of their spouse or require that of their spouse. That when your spouse isn't willing or able, because a lot of times it's an impossible thing to ask our spouse to be our emotional regulator. It's definitely in the long term. And when we can take care of our own emotional regulation and let our spouse take care of their own emotional regulation, it's a much more securely based relationship where we're not blaming, trying to control or manipulate the other person into taking care of our emotional regulation. And what this does not mean is it doesn't mean you're absent or you're unfeeling or you're like, not my problem. No, we're acknowledging what the other person is experiencing. We're acknowledging their emotions. We're curious about their emotions. We are definitely interested and concerned about their emotional state and emotional well-being. We're just not taking the role of their emotional regulator. We're not taking the responsibility of the person who's managing their emotional regulation. And what this can create room for is when you have two adults who are in charge of their own emotional regulation, and instead of using the relationship as an emotional dumping ground or as a way to get their emotional regulation, you can use this relationship to love, to enjoy, to co-parent, to have fun, to teamwork, to strategize. I like to think about the idea of creating your own emotional regulation as like you come fed. You've already eaten dinner. You've given yourself the skills of emotional processing and emotional resilience, and you're giving yourself validation and acknowledging your worth, and you're doing that kind of internal work. And then you come to the relationship to share dessert. And that's you're still supporting and validating and reassuring each other, but it's dessert. And instead of coming starving for reassurance or validation or emotional regulation, and then being very needy to your spouse, you're coming filled, and together you enjoy dessert and loving each other and empathizing with each other and validating each other, but not from a place of need, of anxious attachment, but from a place of um, enjoying a lovely treat together. Okay. It's more the secure attachment approach. So I hope this is helpful for you as you think about your own mixed faith marriage. There is probably some area where you are showing up anxiously attached, and it can be really helpful to get curious about that and to start looking at that. Where are you feeling needy? Where are you feeling like a burden? Where are you feeling like your spouse is a burden? And then can you take and develop some skills around emotional regulation? Can you take responsibility for that and develop some skills to manage and work through your own emotions and not dump those on your spouse or expect them to manage those emotions for you? All right. If you're looking for more help for your mixed faith marriage, as always, go to my website, brookeboothcoaching.com, and you can get a free mini course if you want to just get started on getting some kickstart help to your mixed faith marriage. If you want to go more in depth, definitely go take a look at my full length online course. And that has all sorts of tools to help you with things like emotional attachment. All right. Wishing you the very best in your mixed faith marriage.